Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is the last in a series of 8 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 2. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to scan the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, which I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the 3rd stave of page 142 as the gods react to Freya's abduction. Once they've lost the goddess of eternal life, Wotan and his clan take an object lesson in what shirking their debt is likely to spell for them. Loge initiates it virtually a cappella, save for a last pulse on quavers of the opposition stroph's final double impact, his vocal leisurely rising falling on Erda fourths, ended with reverse chord notes. This begins one of those passages often seen as a good deal heavier in poetry than substance. Analysts tend to quickly pass over its narrative, while few productions do much with it beyond dimming the lights as their gods mope about looking dispirited. Musically, though, it's charged with the wave-like nature music from Loge's panegyric, distorted into unique new forms incorporating related syntactic ideas. Loge's vocal line is simplicity itself, an echo of his immediately previous utterance, meaning bouncing on fourths to end on a rising interval. In this case, a low-ash interval disturbs the more sedate earlier line. Its pitches Erda fourths, then finished with a tritone to match the orchestra's eerie harmonic modulation. The band takes the lion's share of focus, as it does throughout most of this final episode before the Scene 2-3 interlude. The implication is, or should be, that remarkable visual details in the stage picture make up for the lack of vocal lines. But this is almost never the case in live productions, most of which hardly even bother with a change of lighting, their gods drooping picturesquely as Loge strolls among them sneering. Valentia is marginally more successful in that, as the lights dim, the futuristic machinery carrying its gods sinks to the ground as they suck on oxygen masks while mists scud across the projected backdrop. However, once those effects are established, Loge is all that animates the stage picture, which pays no more attention to the musical syntax than do any of its fellow productions. It begins spanned by a rising, falling tremolo violin viola chord progression, the most eerily precise foreshadowing yet of Erda Twilight. The present scene, after all, suggests the god's potential end as surely as does Erda's more explicit, if cryptic, Scene 4 prophecy. The module's rising line builds itself, moreover, from 2 strophes of the giant's upward arpeggio, each naturally including its ascending triad, whose prior embryonic recurrences have gradually come to hint at various aspects of abandonment. At its top, coincident with Loge's vocal tritone lift, string tremolos make an uneasy harmonic shift, which initiates a Freya pulse on first oboe, here flaccidly denuded of its winsome panegyric triplet. It begins with the passage's more gradually falling string line, itself redolent of the spear. In the middle of the string descent, with another shivery harmonic shift at the key change, English horn echoes the oboe's Freya strophe. Both iterations are capped with identical but unique distortions of Freya's love module, whose final notes, instead of taking their usual upward cadential rise, slide down on Erda chord notes. This slight alteration makes the Freya syntax pairs of chord notes, another of those seemingly incidental details which return to add further information based on this moment. The effect is multi-layered, the chord note's brooding context, while transforming these two complete iterations of Freya's syntax into pure up-down signs resembling the chordal arch which envelops them, so reminiscent of Ere de Twilight. Commentators pass over this scene, perhaps by judging it of little narrative import. Fafner's already explained that without Freya the god's doom is assured. But actions speak louder than words, and this depiction of Wotan's immortal race crippled by the imminent threat of death charges the approaching Nibelheim mission with great urgency. It also cements Loge's place in the drama, not to mention that of nature generally and Erda specifically, while throwing its syntactic web across all that's to come. In this light, it doesn't last a moment too long. Most obviously, the fire god now takes complete control of events, which he won't relinquish until the ring is in Fafner's hands, a fact confirmed throughout the passage as his vocal alone trips along through a host of jaunty syntactic modules, most of them energized by the work's long-short-long rhythm, eloquent of nature's vitality. This also reveals a host of connections between Loge's natural powers and the gods' inherent flaws leading them towards apocalypse. For death, now staring the immortals in the face, is natural and inevitable, a truth Freya's gifts have allowed them to ignore. Tangentially, the tremolo descent parses itself into a pair of reverse melody notes, bookending a Welterbe triad, Wotan's racial imperative threatened by this dire event. As the violin-viola tremolo line continues its descent, a flute winds almost sweetly up and down another altoed Freya strophe as Loge sings a Welterbe triad, a sly poke at Wotan's fading hopes. After a quaver minim rest, the fire sprite goes on with a crib on the ring's allure resembling Wotan's earlier vocal, and those following it. Since Fro, who in the mythology is Freya's sole brother, is all that's left to remind the gods of his sister's youthful glitter, two muted horns in a touchingly hopeful major mode atop tremolo's string pedal answer with the first measure of his morphine, an Apple's variant both on natural down-up signs like the ring and Valhalla Part 1. Strings then delicately wither into minor mode, and middle woodwinds with tremolo second violins sigh a strophe of the grim Apple's distortion, earlier introduced as Fafner describes the god's plight without that fruit, and Loge sidles up reverse chord notes to double it vocally. Violas mix it into a complete Freya pulse, which, once the fire god's vocal lifts a fifth in a low ash interval and falls a prescient Erda seventh, struggles its love module into a doleful shadow of its original form, its rising finish now reverse chord notes, as he concludes with the heroic melody notes, their final interval tinted by a sinister tritone. Woodwinds and second violins repeat the withering module as Freya sounds again, this time on cellos with slightly more force, while Loge's vocal drops a third, rises a minor sixth, another faintly mocking ringlust crib, to pass through a static ash interval, then sink on reverse melody notes to continue his jeer of the god's racial aspirations. Cellos conclude their Freya strophe on a more hopeful rising fifth, only for their last held note to become a wan two-measure trill appoggiatura, while horns voice another partial Fro iteration, this time in pathetic minor, on the ash interval of which the fire sprite continues vocally rising a fourth, as he observes the light gone out of the immortal's eyes. His line descending another reversal of the heroic melody notes through a static ash interval and Welterbe triad, incidentally a weird crib on the ring fragment, the god's nemesis, concluded in almost malicious delight by leaping up a sixth, making the syntax the Rhine maiden's spiteful jollity. This also and again distortedly ghosts the module of the ring's allure, which module the English horn echoes in crotchets at a parallax. A gentle sting on Loge's final word initiates another tremolo violin viola sign, all but identical to that which initiates this passage. In the middle of its rise, massed woodwind's horns carol a single bright strophe of Fro's morpheme, this time completed on its falling spear notes, its progress twice punctuated by abbreviated Valhalla ash intervals on a pair of trumpets in thirds. Atop it, to reverse melody notes, separated by a minim rest from a low ash interval on reverse chord notes, the fire god taunts Freya's brother for his pale, weak face, the immediate effects of aging brought on by nothing more than Freya's departure. Loge turns his attention to Donner as the tremolo wave crests, then sinks, the fire sprite's vocal bouncing up and down thirds to rise after 3 static notes in reverse chord notes, then fall a pathetic sixth, timpani all the while rhythmically outlining the Fro syntax, complete with its spear coda to depict the thunderer's weakness. With Loge's final sixth, the timpani fade on 2 offbeat crotchets, a Valhalla ash interval, then a last quaver crotchet double impact, suggesting the god's hammer strokes fading away, progressively enfeebled. The fire god now turns his attention to Fricka's indisposition, his voice sinking on reverse melody notes into the lift of a third, a skeleton of Flosshilda's heroic module. He then vaguely follows bassoons and multiple divided strings twice as they intone a pathetic harmonic memory of the so-called domestic bliss, its falling 7th Hera tritone. Erda certainly withholds her inspiration at this juncture and, with it, life itself. The fire god saves Wotan for last, as Fafnir's prediction of the very peril they now face sounds twice on woodwinds descanted by Loge's vocal with taunting, spear-like extended reverse melody notes, each of his pulses followed orchestrally by a rapid double iteration of the giant's departure with Freya in triplets, embellished by grace notes, the first on second violins, violas, and cellos, the second weakened to violas and cellos alone, a reminder of the giant's role in this catastrophe. The Meister seems to have drawn his inspiration for the initial half of this scena from the Poetic Edda's Lokasena, if couching its details in gentler terms adapted to his unique narrative purpose. In that ancient poem, Loki confronts the Aesir and Vanir gods at a feast, needling them one by one for their foibles, everything from cowardice to adultery to incest to homosexuality. Here in Rheingold, the fire god's agenda is more singular, his one aim to drive home the immortals' folly in trading away Freya, specifically goading Wotan into his theft of the ring. The goddess's rising portion again winds upward on first clarinet sustained by a long contrabass pedal. The Freya morpheme ended this time with its love module, attempting to reclaim its original form, only to be shattered by a dotted quaver rest before an ascending leap of a 7th. This makes it a duo of chord note pulses, which arco violas, tremolo cellos double with the chords themselves, and Fricka's faint cries of Veha in turn echo their bundles at a parallax. Repeated syntax, raised or lowered a harmonic third, is a habitual procedure Wagner employs throughout the tetralogy to particularly stress crucial syntactic clues. Here it subtly recalls the Rhine Maiden's joyful cries and Alberich's disappointments in love at their hands, while looking forward to Erda's Scene 4 appearance, as well as Siegfried Act 3. The Earth Mother's dreams, as presided over by her henchman Loge, have truly and completely ensnared the immortals, while passing along a grim hint of their relationship to the Nibelung, his golden ring, and his unquenchable hatred born of frustrated love, similar to that which the gods have only just lost. Fricka completes her brief lament over minim Erda chords on arco violas and tremolo cellos as she sings 3 static notes to then rise in a pathetic hope on reverse melody notes. As the contrabass pedal continues, viola's cellos sink in semibreves from another set of chords into a sly chromatic descent, another embryonic hint of magic sleep, parsed as two Erdechord strophes. Weakened Valhalla ash intervals in timpani punctuate the beginnings of every other of the next 7 measures, during which Donner and Fro echo Fricka's distress to identical static note figures. But, unlike her, the 2 male immortals end on chord notes, the Vala's lesson come home to roost with dire certainty. Bassoons, which have stealthily crept into the sleep chording, take focus by lifting on the abandonment triad to resume what seems another strange hybrid, a Welterb triad that becomes the apples fro syntax with the rhythmic bounce of the Rhine Maiden Scene 1 taunting, complete with its own abandonment triad. 2 horns repeat this odd figure, now with both triads, as Loge cries he's grasped the cause of their plight on a plunging 5th, which, after a crotchet rest, he concludes with the Welterb triad and chord notes as part of a reverse melody note pulse. His announcement is mere eyewash for the gods, of course, since by the terms of this analysis, the Fire Sprite and Erda have strategized this outcome right down to its every particular, since even before the Rheingold's theft. Nonetheless, it's wrapped in pointed irony, the syntax of their abandonment of the love goddess side by side with their hopes for sexual regeneration. First violins gently oppose Loge's vocal triad with a rising one, which swells another third into an ironic retrograde of the ring fragment capped by a ghost of fate, then, joined in major mode by seconds, gradually lift a more leisurely version of the taunting module towards the upper registers, thus 5 times repeating its rising triad, driving home its associations with abandonment, linked to the giants. The Fire Sprite's vocal pinpoints what ails the immortals, their lack of Freya's Frucht, sung to the dismal reverse ash interval on the descending 7th of Erda's inspiration, then rising on another triad into a teasing strophe of Albrecht's wooing, its ascent flattened into melody notes, thus stressing its similarities to the giant turn, with its threat to immortal racial hegemony. This triggers the apples morpheme in its original incarnation, sweet on 2 horns and clarinets, all but identical to its first complete appearance during Fafner's original description of the fruit's powers. Violins, violas, and cellos maintain a long octavo pedal, the timpani's Valhalla ash pulses now replaced with caressing harp strums, while the Fire Sprite describes the immortal's regular life-giving meals with a line conformed to the apple morpheme's outline, twice adding grace notes to its chord note oppositions, its high ash intervals left intact. It should be recalled that the morpheme's second half includes the Welterb triad, which here Loge intones vocally, very like as Fafner has done, with the one telling difference that the fire god's first strophe truncates the triad, only giving it whole in its second pulse. Already the immortal grip on racial power has begun to fade and decay, though with a hope of its being restored, all part of Loge's subtly nudging Wotan towards Erda's desired outcome, meaning their trip to Nibelheim. When the fire god shifts to the loss of their gardener and the withering fruit which results, the texture darkens, English horn and bassoon sighing Fafner's prediction with a horn pedal, a double iteration of what might almost be the ring, but for the 2 last notes of its Welterb triad flattened to chord notes. Loge's vocal is less rigid, falling on chord notes into a low ash interval on a 4th, repeating a seemingly inadvertent Welterb triad, pinpointing Freya as source of their world inheritance, while also hinting at the gods' potential rescue from their crime against nature by racial means. He passes across 3 static notes, including a low ash interval on a 4th, from which he plunges a condemning 5th. After a dotted crotchet rest, starting a tritone above, he falls chromatically in a lengthy spear-like module, interrupted haltingly throughout by 4 quaver rests to make it a series of chord note pulses. Beneath him, legato woodwinds shift their Fafner module doubling into a phrase that sounds like nothing so much as another and more decisive embryonic version of Magic Sleep. Pizzicato quaver cello chords marching down with his vocal on first and third beats. This recalls the immediately previous laments of Fro and Donner, its final two measures also hinting at resignation, and a solitary crotchet rest followed by a last quaver interruption isolates the word foul, giving tragic emphasis to the module as a whole. Magic Sleep must await further explanation until the discussions of Valkyr and Siegfried. It's a morpheme whose import this analysis contends outstrips the extant literature's view, in that it applies neither to Wotan nor Brunhilde, but to Erida's powers over them both, and others. Nor is this Magic Sleep's last Rheingold intimation. But for now, its transformational powers infuse the subtext of this unique passage, the Vala's control strongly hinted at by this successive progression of Erda chords and chord notes. The mood shifts, Loge's chord note module tripping down on strings as he flippantly shrugs off this gloom with a dry, quasi-recitative aside, sniffing the apples hardly matter to him, since he's always been denied them by Freya. His vocal is a series of two accusative falling spear-like scales, each pulse capped with the pizzicato string crotchet chord. The second reverses into melody notes, giving it the ironic feel of a giant turn, to suggest his greater sympathy for that race. He finishes with a little turn, a hint of Albrecht's threat capped by another string pizzicato to launch a final extended melody note reversal, another hint of resignation. Viola's cellos answer by racing up his chromatic scale into 5 minim woodwind chords syncing chromatically, which amount to a pair of Erda chords that invoke Magic Sleep. These support Loge's revelation of his half-breed status, a telling detail he sings to an odd crib halfway between his basic chord note module and its development as the morpheme Cook names scheming, yet more confirmation that syntax is particular to the fire god alone, never mind that he uses those powers against the gods as much as he does their enemies. The Meister's fire sprite says of himself, "Den halb so echt nur bin ich wie selige ihr," a racial descent extrapolated from the myths with dubious authority. In the prose Edda, the mythic Loki is son of a giant with a known history, but whose mother is never otherwise identified. Despite this, he's routinely called an Aesir, meaning of Odin's clan, itself another giant bloodline. Outside Loki's frequently wretched behavior, the myths give no clue he's a half-breed in the sense the ring implies. Introducing that concept here in Rheingold suggests a pair of ideas, especially as the fire god stresses how essential Freya is to the god's immortality. Loge doesn't seem to care he's stinted the apples, as if their gift of eternal life were unnecessary to him, which is only logical because the natural energy of fire is itself deathless. Rather, what he resents is Freya's rudeness, who's thrown herself in with Wotan's clan. This not only implies Loge's true source of life and allegiance lies with its original fount, meaning Erda, but also that, should the gods perish from lack of the apples, he would remain alive and unscathed. The fire god concludes his gripe against the immortal's stinginess by syncing on reverse melody notes into reverse chord notes, whose two pitches are separated caustically by a semiquaver rest to isolate the word Ir, meaning Valhalla's immortals, of whose tribe he's not quite a part. Cello's violas respond with his chromatic scale, skittering up into glittering diminished seventh tremolos, a neat depiction of his annoyance, atop which he scolds his dubious half-brethren for handing the giants this deadly advantage. Over sustained tremolos, his vocal scampers through a further quasi-recitative in order to throw focus on its words, its first phrase berating their reliance on Freya with a pale upward turn juxtaposing chord notes defeated by an extended version of its giant opposition, mirrors of his robbery advice, a bundle which ends in an upward third and chord notes parsed through a reverse ascendable. After a quaver rest and a bounce on thirds, his next phrase moves through 4 static notes, the last of them moving into a reverse ash interval, as he reminds his masters of the giant's target, which his next phrase confirms is Euer Leben, by rising from 3 static notes on another third, followed by a dire inverted ash interval, 2 more static notes, and another third descent, making the whole a Welterbe triad with its racial inferences. The first time the texture attaches this developing module directly to the god's future existence. The fire god rests only a semiquaver, then ends his warning by leaping up a sixth and down an air to fourth into a truncated downward turn, again resembling the giant's. This vocal is punctuated by 2 forceful staccato major mode quaver chords on full strings, leaping up an air to fourth to echo their similar double impacts, the giant's threat to immortal plans. He goes on to point out what is by now obvious, yet whose ominously rich syntactic detail gives it special weight. Developing in more portentous detail Fafner's prediction of what we now see on stage, Loge's words and syntax rehearse a skillfully altered reprise of that dire prognostication, its elements mixed in a new way. The apple's initial falling syntax repeats first on 2 oboes, echoed by 2 lone horns at the lower octave, then clarinets ghosted by bassoons. At a parallax, Loge descants this apple's bundle vocally to reinforce its associations with the immortal's downfall, leading with a static ash interval and, after an air to fourth bounce, moving through a reverse interval on chord notes, finished with an apple's echo, underlining the syntax's eerie resemblance to resignation. Cellos divisi in 4, supported by a quartet of contrabasses, twice intone Fafner's diacrib on the apple's initial falling pulse, the lower strings whispering chords. Atop this passage, Loge's vocal is equally rich in syntactic detail, as he sings an abandonment triad in dour minor 7th harmony, the text burgeoning its syntactic weight, its last notes a low ash interval on a wan rising third. Concluding the syntactic weight, his last notes are haltingly interrupted by quaver rests, breaking its words at their syllables to depict the immortal's waning strength as he intones another lugubrious reverse interval falling on chord notes. It's only here that low brass creep in for the first time in many measures to sustain his vocal with a softly threatening chord iteration, punctuated on timpani with the most minimal of Valhalla ash intervals. The brass finish, along with the fire god's vocal, on a dire plunging fifth, its capping low-string pizzicato like a period to their hopes. Compared to his mythic counterpart, Rheingold's Loge treats the immortals gently, while still dealing them a left-handed needling analogous to the poetic Edda's Lokasena. For his temerity, the Eddic gods wreak terrible vengeance on Loki, but the Meister's demigod emerges unscathed, even empowered. The passage's syntax underlines the fire god's critique of the gods, its deeper message constantly implying that life prolonged beyond its natural time is itself unnatural. It's this, almost as much as their other crimes, which arouses Erda's enmity, a favor she would do the giants should they keep hold of Freya. Thanks to her unseen influence, Loge gets what he's been angling for since long before his entrance. Rather than turning the accusation back on him, as does the mythic Frigg, Frigga now takes Loge's side against Wotan, singing atop no more than a pianissimo timpani roll to underline her weakened state. Resisting their imminent doom, she flaccidly berates him with a pair of chord note oppositions, which must of needs include the melody notes themselves, while also hinting yet again at the giant turn. 2 clarinets join her third phrase, completing this picture as she moans a slowly descending spear line built from static notes, chord notes, a reverse ash interval on chord notes, more chord notes, a static interval, and concluding reverse melody notes, her own unconscious appeal to Wotan's nascent breeding imperative, here especially fraught with resignation. This moves horns to join the clarinet in an eerie ring strophe, capped with an energetic sting triggered by opposing demi-semiquaver scales rushing across the string choir and a double impact as Wotan at last springs into action. With 4 marcato crotchet string chord punctuations, he orders Loge down to Nibelheim with him to win the gold. His vocal a Welterb triad, separating out the fire god's name between a quaver and semiquaver rest, then leaping up a third into a reverse ash interval on a plunging fifth. After a crotchet rest, the immortal lifts a minor sixth into a descending spear line phrased as 2 reverse melody note pulses, his mind very much on his racial imperative, which he caps with a falling third. Then, after a last dotted crotchet rest with its crotchet string punctuation, he finishes on chord notes and another sixth which rises into a Freya distortion, vaguely resembling his own lust for the ring's power. What moves the god to this ruthless deed is neither love nor power, justice nor law, but his fear of death. That ethical thread at the heart of Wagner's thesis to Röckel binds all of Scene 2, which the god means to evade, empowered by the ring per the ash interval, and the dream of his race forever dominant as evidenced in the Welterb triad and reverse melody notes. Perversely, the fire god answers Wotan's call to action with his third appeal on behalf of the Rhine maidens, a bewilderingly swift tangle of syntax. Not surprisingly, it begins with the Rhine maidens' incarnation of the Erde chords on woodwinds, though in an edgy minor-major juxtaposition in reversal of Erde's. Loge's vocal accompanies it with a rising Erde fourth, followed by a Welterb triad, then a Rhine maiden crib, built from a downward fourth, bouncing up a third into chord notes. What makes this, his third appeal on the nymph's behalf, particularly interesting is its nervous viola line, a strange foreshadowing of Nibelung syntax resembling his earlier one, with its concurrent implication of the giants. It picks up on his previous taunt for Wotan, though here begun on static, repeated notes. Instead of taking the signature downward turn associated with Nibelungs, however, it twice repeats a reversal of that insidious figure out of the giant's retreat with Freya, with its marked resemblance to the dragon morphine. Coupled with the Welterb triad and the Rhine maiden syntax altered to suggest the Erde module, it's a subtle hint of the Nibelheim visit's coming revelations. Loge's text shifts to returning the gold to its rightful owners on Suite Major, with an echo of the Rhine maiden turn, followed by that crib on their syntactic bouquet ending the fire god's panegyric, one preceded at a parallax in the fire sprite's vocal, and capped in both orchestra and voice with chord notes. Portius notes the Meister placed special emphasis on this specific detail, so much so that Portius includes a musical example. His only explanation is its beauty, but there's more to it, meaning syntax furtively suggesting the gods may hope to have it both ways, meaning the rescue of their youth while honoring their tacit oath to the Rhine maidens by return of the gold. But Wotan's having none of it, who shrugs off this appeal even more brusquely than he has the last two, scolding Loge to "Schweig, Schwätzer," with a reverse ash interval on chord notes, his centrally aroused peak telegraphed as that accusative viola line becomes a swift trill appoggiatura, underlined by contrabasses in the slightly Nibelung staccato. Intoning the word Schwätzer on a hard plunging fifth, after a crotchet rest, Wotan descends on a spear scale, flavored by resignation and capped with chord notes, which he follows with reverse melody notes, echoing that module in the fire god's appeal, the god's thoughts charged with his racial imperative even as he declares their quest is on Freya's behalf alone. He completes the idea to another and extreme distortion of the goddess's module, ironically topped by more chord notes, making them the single most frequent syntactic module in this episode. Though he doesn't know it, the immortal is being led to his next revelation by the very forces covertly opposing him, and in furtherance of their agenda, not his. The fire god thus acquiesces without argument, descending through a reverse ash interval on a sixth into courtly major mode and a melody note strophe in both vocal and violas, which add a winsomely taunting trill appoggiatura to mock that which has just energized Wotan's agitation. Cellos race up a demi-semiquaver scale, a flippant gesture as Loge pointedly suggests a route to Nibelheim via the Rhine. His vocal another reverse ash interval on a plunging seventh to rise through reverse chord notes, and an upward third into the air to melody note opposition of his previous advice. His final pitches also creating Flosshilda's heroic module. This odd mix suggests the fire sprite's duty chafing against his divine master's nascent racial opposition to the giants, and Loge's own covert defiance of this prerogative. Wotan hastily rejects the Rheingold option, with a static triplet capped in air to chord notes, punctuated in the orchestra by nervous scalar twitches on second violins, a succinct picture of his guilty unease. As an alternative, the fire god offers a subterranean route, his vocal led by chord notes into a static ash interval, then a Rhine maiden distortion, which hops up an octave then down another in a reverse ash interval on the words Schwefelkluft. A deft syntactic nod to their coming descent into a world of nature's energies turned against themselves. Second violin's violas punctuate him, tumbling demi-semiquavers into a staccato sting that launches a cello trill appoggiatura. Over this, he finishes his idea with a falling air to fourth to move through another static ash interval into rising air to melody notes that produce a rough outline of fricas defiance. Stage directions call for Loge and Wotan to approach the now smoking cleft, matched by 3 measures of Loge's chromatic scales on cellos, violas, with a timpani roll beneath. The first half taking the module's wonted rising form, the last its reversal. This falls into the fire sprite's darkly shimmering tremolos, which ascend chromatically across 5 measures, an obvious depiction of the sulphur cleft's smoky fires, if less obviously affirming these too arise ultimately from Erda. On the 4th measure, the god orders his fellows to wait until evening, when he'll ransom their verlorner Jugend with gold. His vocal hops over 7 static notes through a static ash interval, then that interval's reverse on a 3rd. He shifts to the idea of their threatened mortality after a quaver rest by leaping up a 6th to linger on another static interval, capped by more chord notes. The brass, silent for so long, hold an ominous pedal chord, then underline his vocal's chord notes, thus creating the chords themselves, only to extend those into reverse melody notes. The resultant semi-brevy underlines woodwinds and horns in a portentous statement of the ring fragment, its initial Welterb triad becoming chords, along with the brass pedal. Rising into this bundle on a 3rd, Wotan falls with the triad, anticipates its chords with optimistic reverse chord notes, a line of potent ambivalence he finishes with the word Gold on a decisive yet sinister plunging 5th, his last utterance until scene 3. As the syntax implies, more issues are involved here than gold alone. The king of the gods embarks on a project whose syntactic core is developing into Welterb triads, their reversals, melody notes, and their reversals. The two descending modules are first associated with Alberich, yet, along with the ascending melody notes, have come to mean something more personal to Wotan, that being his seat of power, the forces of nature set against him, and his need to freely propagate his race, despite its potentially tragic results. The combined opposition of these melody notes, so prominent in the giant turn, has also acquired its own syntactic force as it conflicts with God's procreative urge through the giant's interference, and the prospect of giving back the gold or supporting himself by having it for himself. Wotan leaves for Nibelheim with his plans still very much in flux, his as-yet nascent thoughts of changing his world's racial makeup through procreation yet to blossom into a coherent strategy. During his visit, he finds a host of innovations he hasn't considered, altering his view until he at last hits upon what he takes for the solution to his problems, a scheme which ultimately leads to his doom, yet also beyond it. Loge is the god's dubious psychological midwife, and as horns, low woodwinds sustain an unbroken pedal through another 3 measures, cellos, violas sweep up then down the sprite's chromatics, to depict him disappearing with Wotan into the sulphur cleft. As they disappear, the other gods wish their master luck, Donner to a static ash interval and a falling 5th, Fro a pair of rising outer 4ths, and Fricka, after a static ash interval, descending in a spear scale, redolent of resignation, as she begs him to return soon. She caps her line with Flossilda's heroics by rising to her final note on that wonted 5th, which eventually defines the module as one of the tetralogy's pivotal morphemes. And there we must leave it until the next video picks up where this one leaves off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 152, beginning the mighty Scene 2-3 interlude. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.